Thank you very much. And at the risk of conflict of interest, I am going to include in the list of thanks to the director of the Southern Asian Institute, Janaki Bakle, professor of history, who has worked tirelessly, and I can attest to that, to organize this event and has been doing so over the course of some months. So I'm delighted to recognize her role. This is a conference to examine the place of caste in contemporary India, but it is also to celebrate the connection of B.R. Ambedkar to Columbia University. It is here that Ambedkar studied and earned a PhD in political science. Even closer to home for me, it is here that Ambedkar wrote his first paper on the caste system, delivering it in Franz Boas's famous anthropology seminar in 1916, in which he argued that a combination of the social logic of endogamous exclusion and the role of prestige attached to the Brahmin in Hindu religion combined to produce the extraordinary durability and hold of the caste system. And it is here at Columbia that Ambedkar began his study of the political character and effects of different kinds of political institutions, including the Constitution, or at least other constitutions than India's. He would go on, of course, to play a major role in that. Although Ambedkar went on from Columbia to do his formal legal training at the London School of Economics, we like to claim a very special role for Columbia in the conception and drafting of the Indian Constitution, which bans discrimination based on untouchability and enshrines a number of critical principles framing provisions for reservations or reserved seats in education and government employment for historically oppressed groups, classified, of course, on the basis of the sociological categories of caste and tribe. As a university, we take great pride in our connection to Ambedkar, in the extraordinary accomplishments of his life fighting against injustice, and in his lifelong commitment to finding and using political and legal means to redress the social and cultural legacies of oppression and discrimination. For B.R. Ambedkar, caste was the principal impediment to social justice, equality, and reform in India. But caste for him was not just a civil institution, for it was inseparable from the beliefs and institutions of Hinduism more generally. Despite this latter concern, one that stayed with him throughout his life and led ultimately to lead him to convert to Buddhism just the year before he died. He was both a social activist and a constitutional lawyer. He led marches and demonstrations, wrote tracts and gave speeches, while also making perhaps his most enduring mark through his role as principal architect of the Indian Constitution, convinced as he was that untouchables could only thrive through constitutional guarantees for non-discrimination and reservations in educational opportunity, employment, and political representation. Born in 1891 into a Maharashtrian Mahar, then called untouchable, family, Ambedkar studied in army cantonments and then in Bombay, graduating from Elphinstone College in Bombay in 1912. His educational attainment and social distinction gained the recognition of the Maharaja Gaikwad of Baroda, who gave him a scholarship for travel here to New York to Columbia, where he studied towards his PhD, as I said, in political science. He only actually received his degree in 1927, but he was here in the years just before and at the outbreak of World War I. After returning from London, where he also did his legal work at the LSE, he returned to practice as a lawyer in Baroda, finding that despite his educational attainments and accomplishments, he was unable to rent rooms in town, and he was the victim of continual insults having to do with his caste status. So he moved to Bombay, where he became a college lecturer and a practitioner before the Bombay High Court. In 1927, he was officially nominated to the Legislative Council as one of the two representatives of the depressed classes. During the next 2 decades, he maintained a role as a prominent figure in official circles as well as in government, at the same time that he took up a series of political and social struggles on behalf of his fellow, again I say untouchables, but of course we now say Dalits, including the cause of educational access, the work towards abolishing traditional village duties, various campaigns to gain access to public water, and of course repeated movements for temple access for Dalit groups. Ambedkar also mounted several dramatic symbolic assaults on Hindu scriptures, illustrating his sense that since caste was so integral to Hinduism, the religion itself had to be questioned and deeply scrutinized. Even as Ambedkar took Gandhi on over the question of whether religion and caste could be detached from each other, he famously dueled with Gandhi over separate electorates for untouchables. The quarrel took on epic proportion in 1932 when Gandhi announced a fast unto death over the establishment by Ramsay MacDonald of a separate electorate for untouchables, in large part as a consequence of Ambedkar's advocacy of depressed classes' interests at the Round Table Conference. Gandhi was opposed to separate electorates for any group. He grudgingly accepted them for Muslims, for Christians, for Sikhs, and for Anglo-Indians, but drew the line when it came to Dalits. The Communal Award of August 17, 1932, granted Dalits Ambedkar's demand for separate electorates in areas of their largest concentration, and that is what led to the fast. Ambedkar ultimately had to give in to Gandhi's plea, although they worked out a compromise known as the Pune Pact, in which the electorate was maintained as joint, while the numbers of seats specifically reserved for untouchable groups was doubled. And this was a huge rupture in the history of Indian nationalism, and it continues in some sense to underwrite and carry on with later debates over how to think about the nature of the Dalit community vis-a-vis the Hindu majority. Throughout his life, Ambedkar oscillated between legal and political advocacy for the role of depressed classes in Indian society and symbolic protests against the deep stigmatization produced by caste and its core relationship to Hinduism itself. His concern about incorporation into the Hindu fold put him in conflict with many Hindu leaders, claiming untouchables as part of the Indian Hindu majority, a claim he decisively rejected when he converted to Buddhism, and indeed advocated the mass conversion to Buddhism of all Dalit groups. In his role in drafting and framing the Indian Constitution, Ambedkar successfully advocated for a policy of compensatory discrimination, a very strong form of affirmative action for the scheduled castes. These are the Dalit groups that had been denominated by the government as scheduled, put on a particular schedule, and tribal groups as well, called the scheduled tribes. And the Constitution declared, and Ambedkar played a great role in the framing of these words, I'll quote, "The state shall promote with special care the educational and economic interests of the weaker sections of the people, and in particular the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and shall protect them from social injustice and all forms of exploitation." End of quote. The Constitution's ban on discrimination in government employment explicitly permits the state to go on to make, though, in addition to this, and I quote again, "any provision for the reservation of appointments or posts in favor of any backward class of citizens which, in the opinion of the state, is not adequately represented in the services under the state." End of quote. And in particular, in regard to efforts not just to ban discrimination, but to counter its legacies and its continuing effects, the Constitution further stipulated that the discrimination clause specifically shall not, I quote, "prevent the state from making any special provision for the advancement of any socially and educationally backward classes of citizens or for the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes." End of quote. Provisions banning discrimination and declaring the principle of individual equality thus had to sit side by side with provisions that made clear not only that special provisions be made, but that they be made through the use of reservations. The Constitution initially dictated reservations that in effect set aside roughly 22% of seats in government employment, legislative positions, and educational institutions for scheduled tribes and castes. While it framed the hope that such reservations would not be necessary in perpetuity, it also allowed for their continuation, up to a maximum of 50%. Now, as we are having this conference here at Columbia, indeed one of the most distinguished among American universities, but also one that has struggled, like many of our peers, with the legacies of our own countries and in this case of our city's history, it is, I think, fitting that we begin our examination of the history and consequences of affirmative action in India with specific reference to the history and current condition of affirmative action here in the U.S. and especially in U.S. universities. It is therefore especially fitting that we do so given the role of the president of Columbia University, Lee Bollinger, in framing the contemporary debate over affirmative action. One of the nation's leading scholars of First Amendment issues, he has taught and written on freedom of speech in the press for over 30 years and has a book, in fact, a new book on the place of the press in a new global and, of course, new economic environment coming out just in a few months, I think. But in addition to his work as a scholar on First Amendment issues, freedom of the press, and the like, he was also the named defendant in the twin 2003 Supreme Court cases that clarified and upheld affirmative action in higher education. And President Bollinger became, in part through that, a national advocate for diversity and for integration. In recognition of his leadership on these issues, he received the National Humanitarian Award from the National Conference for Community and Justice and the National Equal Justice Award from the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, among many other honors, including the Clark Kerr Award, which is the highest honor conferred by the faculty of the University of California for his service to higher education, especially in matters relating both to freedom of speech and diversity. President Bollinger is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society, and prior to coming to Columbia, served as the president of the University of Michigan, where he was also dean of the law school and a law professor. Now, this panel for me is a personal pleasure and a bit of a reminder of the first time I ever met Lee Bollinger, which was at the University of Michigan in 1996, shortly before I was to move to Columbia, where I gave a paper on the aftermath of the Mundell Commission's report and the controversy surrounding questions having to do with reservations in the 1990s. And President Bollinger took time out of his busy schedule then to come and listen to the paper, and then, and now I should have known better, asked me the hardest questions I got all evening in the seminar that ensued. But he made me think deeply at that point about the similarities as well as the differences of the Indian and American experiences, and made me also feel the need for the kinds of things that we do in area studies context to be brought out and moved into conversation with and comparison against other cases, but of course, in some ways, chief among them, the case within which we live, which is to say, in this case, the case of the struggle over affirmative action in the United States. Whether dealing with the historical legacies of slavery and racial discrimination, or caste oppression and caste-based forms of discrimination, it is inescapable that these two great democracies, India and the United States, have struggled to enshrine principles of individual equality while also seeking to address the tremendous historical and sociological impediments to equality that continue to the present day. But these two countries have done so very differently, even though histories of caste and race, of untouchability and slavery share so much in common. Differences intensified in the US case around the famous Bakke case of 1978, when Justice Powell made his declaration about the value of diversity for all, not just for oppressed groups. President Bollinger himself defended the University of Michigan's admission policies around principles of diversity, not by defending quotas or reservations, and of course the outcome of Grutter and Gratz, short-lived though they might have been in Michigan itself for reasons that perhaps we'll go into, was one that put further restrictions on a system that might look in any instance like it was using quantitative rather than qualitative measures. President Bollinger is joined in this panel by two scholars, and we could not be luckier to have the assembled group here this morning. Mark Galanter, who has been for many years professor of law and South Asian studies at the University of Wisconsin, wrote perhaps the seminal work on the history of compensatory discrimination in India, a book entitled Competing Inequalities, Law and the Backward Classes in India. He's also written Law and Society in Modern India, along with many, many other essays and works relating to some of the issues that we're addressing today, and we're delighted that he drove in from Madison to join us at our panel. And Pratap Banu Mehta, who is